Maybe you like sabres and maybe you like longswords. So what about a longsword sabre? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, and I'm at Olympia Auctions because there's an upcoming auction on the 26th of June, link below to the catalogue, and in that is this wonderful, wonderful late 15th or early 16th century Hungarian or Venetian, should we say, and we'll come to a better explanation of that in a second, longsword sabre, for want of a better term. What do we call this? Is it a falchion? Is it a messer? No, it's not really a messer. But fundamentally, this is a type of sword which comes around within the sphere of influence of Venice, specifically related to the Schiavoni. And now the Schiavoni were mercenaries who came from Dalmatia, gives us the name for Dalmatian dogs, incidentally. That's why they're popular in Italy, and they were mostly sort of Croatian and down there, so the former Yugoslavia down the coast there, and they provided lots of mercenaries to the state of Venice. Now at the time, Italy was divided into many city-states. Venice was one of the richest ones, and they drew mercenaries from these Slavic areas, and they brought their own styles of weapons. And in fact, they influenced Venetian swords as well. So you may know of their Schiavona. Now the Schiavona is a type of Venetian basket-hilted sword, but if we look at its prototypes, its earliest stages of development, if we look at the pommels and we look at the crossguards, you'll see that they're rather like this because they come from this area. But this type of blade is also influenced by earlier Hungarian sabres. So we've got all sorts of influence mixed into one sword. And in fact, we find these types of pommels excavated archaeologically in Hungary, also in the former Yugoslavia, so Croatia and Slovenia and so on. This type of pommel here, almost kind of rectangular or square, sometimes with the corners cut off like this. And we find these recurved S-shaped quillons also in those areas. And of course, the sabre has its origins going all the way back into the sort of Turco-Mongol sabres and the Avar swords and this kind of stuff. So all the way back into sort of pre-1000 AD. But by the time we get to the 15th century, sabres were developing into what would later be known now as sabres in Hungary and Poland. And these were extending down into areas, starting to influence swords in areas further south and further west. Now, this sword, therefore, is essentially a sabre blade of that region, or at least it has its origins in that area, in its design. And you even see it has a raised yeoman. Okay, so if we look here, it has the raised yeoman that we find on really early Turkish kilich, very early ones going all the way back to the 13th century. This, however, is probably latter half of the 15th century or beginning of the 16th century. And it has the characteristic type of pommel that has been around at least since the 14th century. And these quillons are something, originally they have straight quillons and gradually they get these S-curved, and these quillons are partly how I would date this personally. So if we just had this blade and we just had this pommel, we could easily call this 15th century. If we just had that pommel, it could even be 14th century. But with that guard, that probably pushes it towards the end of the 15th or beginning of the 16th century. Now, in terms of the features of this sword, the first thing I have to say is this handles like a dream. Okay, this handles absolutely wonderfully. The blade here is a sabre blade that you could almost detach and put onto a 18th century or Napoleonic era light cavalry sabre. It is light, it has got bags of distal taper, it is very flexible and thin up here in the blade. It's the mass distribution is all down towards the hand. It's incredibly light and nimble, and the edge geometry is super fine. It's got a very fine and thin edge. Despite the fact that it's got corrosion and has obviously been cleaned, it has a very thin cross section to where the edge is down here. So compared to a lot of other medieval swords of this period, the only thing in terms of feeling that this was really comparable with is the Alexandria type 19 blades, often with finger rings. And these are particularly light and nimble swords that are very nice, with the one-handed ones are very nice to use with a buckler. They're almost like the predecessors to side swords, and in fact they're where basically side swords and later rapiers kind of start their development. But this is married to a longsword hilt. So what they've essentially done here is they've got a 15th century longsword hilt married to the sabre blade. So this is a melding of cultures. This is a little bit of Dalmatian, a little bit of Venetian, a little bit of Hungarian, all ending up in this wonderful thing that's a two-handed sabre. And some people might say, Matt, is this like a European katana? And no, basically. Katana has enough differences from this, particularly in the blade. Obviously in the hilt, but also the blade is fundamentally different to a katana because this has a lot of distal taper and is very flexible, which katana blades are not. Katana blades are shorter, thicker, stiffer, and very different edge geometry. This blade is like an 18th or 19th century sabre blade married to a longsword hilt, and it feels great. Now I know that some of you will want to know the stats on this bad boy, and this is 37-inch blade, which I think is 94 centimeters. The distal taper, it has bags of it. It starts out at the base of the blade at 8 millimeters, so it's not as thick as some of the other double-edged swords around, or some of the bigger, long swords. So 8 millimeters at the base, but then it goes down rapidly down to about 4.5 millimeters down here at the middle of the blade, down at the tip to only 2 millimeters. And when you look at this blade in kind of close up, what's notable is it has more or less linear distal taper for the first 2/3 of the blade, but then the last end of the blade, particularly the last probably quarter, really goes really thin. And this is a feature we see, as I said, on the Alexandrian Type 19 blades, but it's also a feature we see on later sabres. So when you pick up something like a 1796 light cavalry sabre or a 1788, or lots of these kind of military, late 18th century swords, they have very similar distal taper and proportions to this blade. They are very thick at the base, 8 millimeters in this case, then rapid descent down to 4.5 millimeters at the middle, then kind of stays the same for a big region of the middle, and then really steps down to really super thin for the last part of the blade. But the result is it handles absolutely fantastically. What an absolute gorgeous in the hand sword. And one thing also to say about the guard is that it protects the hand on the inside line here and the outside line here. So it is very much deliberately intended to be a right-handed sword. If this was a left-handed sword with the left hand at the top, the curls would have to go the other way around. So this is intended to be held with the right hand at the top and the left hand at the bottom as a right-handed longsword person. But honestly, if this had a grip on it, this would be quite comfortable to use in one hand as well. So if you're on horseback and riding, you could use this as a one-handed sabre because it's so light and so well balanced. It really handles like an absolute dream, and that is lot 209. Check out the link down below to see the full catalogue, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this as much as I've enjoyed handling it. I don't think you have, because I've really enjoyed handling this one an awful lot. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I see you for the next video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.